Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the One Thing podcast. I am here with Dr. Manu Kapur, who is a world-renowned expert on learning and currently heads the Future Learning Initiative at ETH University Zurich. Dr. Kapur is known for his pioneering research on intentionally designing for and learning from failure, demonstrating how this approach can lead to more effective learning compared to traditional methods. You might know him from his multiple extremely successful TED Talks, but he's here to talk to us today about his new book, Productive Failure. I'm so excited to have you. Welcome.
Thank you, Nikki. It's a pleasure to be here.
Manu, we got to chat a little bit before we started, but this is just such a heavy topic for most people. Why is it that we resist or dislike failure so much, even though we often know intellectually or conceptually that it's the path forward, and yet we resist it and dislike it so much? Why is that?
Well, in part because failure doesn't feel good. And something that doesn't feel good has a very strong emotive charge. And we know from the study of emotions also what happens physiologically and also in your brains is that leaves a very strong impression. And part of why we learn from failure is that it's like the double-edged sword. It's the flip side of that. It's because it leaves a very strong impression. It also gives you the possibility of learning from it because it stays with you.
So talk to us about this. Your research is primarily focused around the science of failure, which I want to get into, but I'd love to know the impetus of this for you. Something that so many people fear or so many people resist, you've made your life's work. So I'd love to know how you got into this in the first place and why this particular subject that you're so passionate about.
The dots always connect when you look back. So, I started out wanting to become a professional soccer player, which didn't work out. And then I became an engineer and then a teacher and then an academic. So, and at every step of the way, I failed like 3 or 4 careers myself. So it was on hindsight, it was not planned in any way like that. But on hindsight, it just seemed that I would want to go into, study failure for my academic, for my research. And that's what I ended up doing.
I thought to myself when I've listened to your TED Talks and going through the book, I thought to myself, what a genius Manu is, because now you can fail at anything and it's fine. It's just your research.
I know, and it also makes you comfortable with the fact that yes, even if you fail, you're going to get over it. And not just get over it.
I was just about to ask you, is there like a freedom to that you can literally do anything? There's no rules because your entire study is around failure. So if you fail, it's just sort of part of the process.
Yeah, and you know that you will learn from it and come out stronger. And while you're going through it, yes, it sucks, but but once you go through the process, keep your wits about yourself. I think then you know that you're going to come out stronger.
Well, I was excited because I was hoping that you were going to get on here and lie to me and tell me that eventually it gets easier. It sounds like it always sucks.
Yeah. No, it always does, because look, by definition, if you want to learn and grow, you've got to put yourself into a zone which is beyond your current skill sets and abilities. And who likes that? Right?
Exactly.
The moment you're in that zone, you're going to struggle and you're going to fail. So that's not a bug. It's a feature of deep learning, is that you're struggling. So it's constantly telling yourself, hey, this is a feature, not a bug. That means I'm going to use it as a signal for learning. I'm in the right zone. Instead of saying, oh, something is wrong. No, something is exactly right, because you're in that zone, and that zone is telling you that you're struggling. So
I'd love to hear, I found from so many of the doctors and scientists and researchers that we've interviewed on this show, it's really helped to, and I'm excited to get the actual framework for you, but it's really helped to reframe failure in general for me. Because where in business, we might call it that we failed, or we didn't know what we were doing, or whatever we may say to assign the value to the failure, however we may feel about ourselves. I've noticed that a lot of the researchers that we interview, they had a hypothesis that they tested that was just wrong, which is very much sort of part of the scientific process. And they don't really have an attachment to the outcome. Like they're really walking into it hoping or wondering if they might fail, as opposed to in business, where we approach it hoping that we'll basically do anything not to fail. Why do you think that is?
I think the bottom lines are different, the time horizons are different, and perhaps the goals are different. But paradoxically, even businesses have to innovate. You have to be creative. And the moment you want to do that for your own survival, then you have to have some space. Not everything has to be about failure, but you have to design some space where people can explore ideas, explore solutions that can lead to failure by definition. But also from that, you learn and you iterate and you come out stronger. And in the startup world, that is the clearest way to do it, right? If you wait to produce the perfect product, you failed by definition, because you've lost, the time is gone. Whereas if you design quickly, prototype, do your user studies, learn from it, adapt, that's when you're more likely to succeed.
Well, there's endless research that shows that execution accompanied by failure, right? Building the rocket and failing at building the rocket will allow you to move far more quickly than pontificating about the perfect way to build said rocket.
Exactly. And, it comes very naturally to us, even as children. If you watch children, how they play, how they learn a language, how they learn to figure out their environment, failure is the heart of everything they do. They pick themselves up, they make a mistake, they overgeneralize, they, get it entirely wrong. And this is not just conceptual stuff or, mental phenomena, even learning physically, like how to stand up, how to walk. It's riddled with struggle and failure, but you don't think about it because it's just the normal way. Somehow over time, our society, our culture sort of socializes us into thinking the very things that made for very steep learning curves in our childhood, right? We learn very quickly and very fast. The very things, the very mechanisms that are so important in early childhood, in the first 6-7 years, are the ones that we go against for the rest of our lives, which is very strange to me, right? And so part of the conversation around productive failure is to recognize in the first instance that, failure can be a very powerful teacher, a very powerful mechanism for learning. But then also to shift the conversation to one step forward. This is not just another conversation about, failure can be good for learning. There are lots of people who say that, right? Where productive failure moves the conversation to is, if failure can be powerful for learning, why do we wait for it to happen? I think that's the starting point. Why don't we actively, intentionally, deliberately design? What if we could design for it? What if we could understand that we could design for it in a safe way where people can struggle, explore, and fail? What if you can understand the science behind it to know precisely what happens in your body, in your mind, when you go through this safe space of failure? And then you harness that failure for learning. It's just that shift, that we're trying to engender with productive failure, to be very deliberate about it.
Well, I know every listener is thinking exactly what I am. So how do we do that? How do we design for it? And how do we do it in a way that's safe? And I know that's exactly the premise of the book. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So, the productive failure is basically a two-phase design. So, if you look at your traditional learning methods in school or in corporate training or, in higher education or wherever you are, whenever you're learning something new, we kind of make the assumption that, let's make this easy, and that would ease learning, right? So if you're in school or in the university or in a training environment, almost the first thing that the trainers would do or the teachers would do is to tell you exactly what the thing is. Let me explain it to you as clearly. Let me show it to you as clearly as possible. Let me tell it to you. It's that thing that, okay, let's just give the knowledge in the best way possible to the novice who's trying to learn something new. Now, it turns out that is a very suboptimal way of learning something new, right? And so what productive failure does is, yes, that telling, that showing is all that knowledge, expert knowledge is really important. But the first thing you need to do is to prepare the novice to be able to receive that. And that's where failure comes in. So productive failure, instead of starting with just direct telling or showing or demoing, in productive failure, we say, well, let's give you a structured set of challenges and activities that are designed in ways that you will necessarily fail to solve them correctly. But hey, the goal in this phase, in the first phase, is not to be able to get to the correct solution or skill or answer. It's just to explore as widely as possible, to generate new ideas, use your intuitive knowledge, use your experience. And this knowledge base, even though it leads to failure, will then help you learn from the same lectures, the same knowledge, expert knowledge that will come in later, right? And that's the idea of productive failure.
Something else you talk about in the book, which I think is really important as it pertains to sort of starting this process of leading into failure and leading into a different way of learning, is some of the coping mechanisms of failure too. Because this is such a different way than we typically approach learning. I think especially in the US, the way that we're taught in school, the way that we approach failure, the way that we approach success is very counterintuitive when you look at your research and what we know actually works for the human mind to develop and grow. So how do we manage to cope with getting it wrong many times before we find the right path forward?
I think one thing is to say it's a mindset shift, but mindsets don't shift until you experience something new, right? It's action in the world. So the first thing is to experience productive failure, either by, having it designed for yourself, or you design this based on others. Even when I work with teachers or professors or corporate trainers, the first thing I take them through is a productive failure experience, because if they're going to design that for somebody else, then they need to experience it for themselves as well. And so we designed the entire training program about productive failure using productive failure itself.
Imagine that, actually using the training to train the trainers, right?
Exactly.
Something you talked about earlier, which has fascinated me as a parent. I always tell the story about, I sort of had this moment when I was watching my daughter as she was learning how to walk, and she just failed over and over and over and over again, as kids do. And I thought I had a moment where I realized so many adults, when they're in that space, whether it be in business or in fitness or whatever it is that they're trying to achieve, they'll fail over and over and over again. Not as many times as a toddler will when they're learning to walk, but they'll fail many times. And then so often they pick their head up one day and say, maybe this just isn't for me. Maybe this just isn't something I'm supposed to be doing. And it was so fascinating to watch my daughter, because there was sort of this biological need to fail and this biological need to try and not succeed. And never once did she look up, Manu, and say, maybe this isn't for me. Maybe this walking thing just isn't going to work out for me. And so I'd love to hear from your research. When does that happen for us? When do we make the shift from failure is a part of life to failure is bad?
Yeah, I don't think there's a definite event, but I think the moment we grow past, you could blame schooling for it, or basically it's culture, right? We get enculturated into a way of thinking about failure, which is not consistent with how we were in the first years of our life, in the first few years of our life. We kind of lose that basic mechanism. And part of what we try to do productive failure is to bring that all back and bring it back in the same safe way. And the reason a child does not give up, if you think about it, is because they feel safe. Even research shows that if a child feels threatened in an environment, they're not going to experiment a lot with whether they're playing with the toys or whatever they're exploring. Their scope of experimentation actually reduces. Right? So a child also has to feel that they are in a safe space for them to be able to do their shenanigans and keep going through all of that. Whereas the moment that the environment is not safe, or the expectations are not exactly aligned to for learning to fail and learning from it, then even a child suffers. Now think about people we as human beings, we get socialized into a particular way of viewing failure. We no longer feel safe to experiment and explore. There's nothing. The capacity is still there. It's just the cognitive architecture. If you think about it, right? Our basic abilities do not change in a generation, 2 generations, or even in 100 years. Evolution does not proceed on that time scale. It takes so much. So our basic capacities are all there. It's just whether we want to shift the conversation and say, no, if failure is powerful, let's bring it back. Let's be intentional. Let's design for it in a safe way.
I love that. And if you're a leader listening to this, how do you create that safe environment within your organization? Because I do see an evolution. We consult so many businesses, and I've been part of so many businesses, where in the early stages, when you're in startup mode, it's easy to fail because you don't really have a product to speak of, and it's okay to innovate. And at that phase of business, everyone feels like it's okay. But as the stakes get higher, it's ironic because as you become more successful, which is a result of all of that innovation that you did, as you become more successful, as you report to investors, as you report to the public, if you become publicly traded, then some of that innovation I find consistently goes away. So how do you create an environment of safety for people to fail?
Yeah, I mean, so, more than 50 years or 70 years ago, there was the concept of psychological safety, right? When you're early in a startup mode, when you're in a team, you're like misery loves company, everybody's in it together, right? You go through that, and I think everybody feels safe in that environment. As you grow, I think it's hard to scale, but several scholars have talked about psychological safety and the importance of doing that. What I like to think about is when we become successful and we start reporting to shareholders, we look at only one metric largely, which is the profit, right? I mean, and that's the one value. And I try to tell leaders also look at your failure signal. So if you are designing, so I'll give you an example. I went to an innovation lab at a multinational company, and they were showing me, we are a research R&D lab within the company, so that we can start new projects, experiment with new product lines, etc., etc. And I went through it, and then the R&D chief, I said, so how many of these projects are actually successful? I said, all of them are successful. They're all doing really well. And I said, well, you're not an innovation lab anymore then. Because there's no failure. If you're really exploring something, if you're really at the cutting edge, then, out of 20 projects you show me, at least 5, 6, 7, depending on your risk appetite, should be utter disasters. Not because you're aiming for disasters, it's just the nature of things that when you try to go beyond and push beyond the boundaries, that then you will find that as a signal. So it's not celebrating failure for failure's sake, it's celebrating the fact that you're pushing the boundaries, and you know that you've pushed the boundaries. How do you know that? When you get failure as a signal. So and it's a balance, right? In any company, you can't just be all about failure, then you go nowhere. Right? It's that exploitation balance that every company has to have, right? And different sectors will allow you a different set of balance, but at least start using failure as a signal, as a metric to see, whether your teams, your employees, your people, your company as a whole, are you sufficiently exploring beyond the edge that you see failure? And this is not the failure that comes out of incompetence or laziness or stupidity. No, this is the failure that's a signal of trying new things, trying to push the boundaries. That's when failure happens.
I'd love for you to talk a little bit more about that balance, because I could see someone taking this conversation and saying, well, I can just fail at everything and I don't have to be accountable for any results. That's the best path forward, which we obviously know isn't either. Extremes on either side of almost anything are typically never positive. So how do you not only find that balance as a person who's exercising this, but also as a leader who's encouraging it?
Very simply, not to talk about the failure per se. What we want to talk about is, what is the new thing? What is the challenge? What is the area? Where did you venture that was unknown, challenging, and hard, where you were struggling? I think that's the conversation you want to have. Failure is just the byproduct, right? So I know there are companies, of course, if you just keep to the conversation around failure, people celebrate failure days, people do this. That kind of misses the point. It's just, playing lip service sometimes. But really, substantively, the conversation has to be, what are the things you've tried, like in an appraisal, for example, what are the things this year you've tried where you've really pushed yourself to go beyond the boundaries, attack problems or challenges, and they still haven't worked out? Tell me about those, right? And that's the conversation we want to have.
I love that. And something you and I talked about, but before we jumped on, was how this conversation is really different from a lot of the conversations that people have had in the past about failure and how to approach it. And I'd love for you to expand on that and really talk about what is the differentiation between this method and what's new about the research that you brought forward.
Yeah. So I think the new part is something, I mentioned a little bit earlier. We are not just waiting for failure to happen. In a normal humdrum of business, professional, personal lives, failure is going to happen. You will fall down. You may not be able to do your gym routine. If you're learning a language, you will, may not be able to do it properly. You have a relationship problem, a work problem. All these things are naturally going to happen. And we say, okay, when these things happen, you try to learn from it. That's all good. Productive failure is not about that kind of failure when it happens in your life. Productive failure is, I'm about to learn something new. I want to learn a new sport, a new skill, a new challenge, whatever it is. Yeah? If I'm in that zone where I'm trying to learn something new, I'm trying to grow, and I know that failure can be a powerful learning mechanism, then I'm not going to wait for it to happen. I'm going to actively, deliberately design for it, or I'm going to seek learning environments where this is intentionally designed for in the first instance. And then I'm going to engage in that and harness that for learning from the expert or knowledge later. I think that's the shift. Don't wait for it to happen. Design for it. It's like energy, right? Sorry. The analogy I give is like, sun carries energy, right? We don't say, well, when the sun comes out, we will make hay. No, we say, well, sun carries energy. Energy is good. Let's actively invent technologies, methods to trap it, to use it, even when the sun is not there. It's that kind of thinking. It's like, if failure can be powerful, it's a good energy source, then let's not wait for it to happen. Let's actively design for it.
And what are some of the ways that you can design for this in your day-to-day environment? Because I know, especially if someone's listening to this and potentially they don't have as much room for failure in their organization. Maybe they're an employee that does a really repetitive tasks and there's not a lot of innovation to be had. And certainly I'm sure you have advice on how to innovate and how to fail forward there. But I'd love to hear how you could implement this in your day-to-day life as well.
Try a new challenge, try a new way of doing things, right? I mean, I think that's again, everybody has to decide what's worth changing. Right? And I think as long as you can decide what's worth changing or what's worth experimenting with, I would say actively go for an experiment on whatever the thing, whether it's, the language you're learning or the dance you're learning or playing a musical instrument or watching a podcast. Experiment with the new way of doing that thing. And in that experimentation, you will learn a lot more than going directly and learning that thing. So and the trick here is to combine the two. It's not to say just go explore, right? The trick is to combine the exploration with the expert knowledge and just to sequence the expert knowledge after the exploration, not before.
And something that our listeners ask a lot about, because we're open to failure on this podcast. We certainly talk about it quite a bit. And when you're listening to any business owner, you almost certainly can't get through their failures without getting to their success. And we interview so many entrepreneurs and business owners on this podcast who it's interesting to hear from them because, and I'm sure you have an opinion on this, they almost relish and talk more about their days of failure than they do of their success. The majority of the time when we're interviewing them about their stories, when we're interviewing them about their journey to get to wherever they eventually culminated, they love telling you about the hard days or the failures that they had. And the success is almost sort of like a pinpoint on a map. I got there, I finished this. It's the shortest part of the story. Why is that?
It leaves a big mark. Failure is the learning event, right? I mean, I think that's been very well established. Failure is the learning event, and it's a learning event that is emotionally very strongly encoded. So you tend to remember that a lot better. And you remember the event, and you also remember what you learned in that event. So it's not surprising that people, when you asked where did you learn the most, or how to describe your journey, people go through their failures. If you ask, even athletes, what do you remember from your competitive career? Yes, they all remember the successes, but you know what? They always also remember the hard games, the really hard games, the narrow losses, and how they tend to push them into experimenting and trying, adapting and changing it in a way that they come out. Without those things, you just don't reach the next level, right? And that's why failure is powerful, as uncomfortable as it can be. That's why it's powerful.
And one of the techniques that you talk about in the book that I'd love for you to expand on here, because one of the challenges that we see, especially talking to our listeners who hear these stories and give us their feedback, they'll say, this is all great because we know the end. And it's hard when you're in the moment to continue to be motivated. If you're like, I'm looking everywhere and all I see is failure. Nothing is going right. And I'm in a space now where I don't know what the right answer is. Do I quit? Do I stay at it? And you talk in the book about motivational hacking, and I'd love for you to expand on any other techniques that are relevant to this. But how do you stay motivated? And also, when do you know that failure means it doesn't work and I should pivot pivot completely, or failure means it doesn't work this way and I need to look for another way to achieve this thing that I'm trying to do.
Yeah, I think, and one way to think about it, I mean, there's several ways to think about it. The way I like to think about it is motivational hacking is always to look at how far you've come. So when you're early on and learning something new, so like I said, you say you have a 200-page book to read, and it's dense, and you want to complete. That's your goal, right? And you want to be motivated to complete that reading that book. And you read the first 5 pages, and then you drop it, and then you come back and look at the next day when you want to start reading again. Say, oh, I've only read 5, got 195 pages to go. See, that is not motivating. But if you said, I compared, I was at 0, today I'm at 5, let me get to 10. So when you're starting out, focus on the early progress, because research suggests that backward comparison early on is actually very useful. It keeps you in the game because you can see, 5 pages today versus from 5 pages yesterday, it's 100% increase. Whereas, 5 pages from a 200-page book, it's a 2.5%. So, it's just a matter of framing and getting used to the fact that you're making progress every day. Then there comes a point in the time in the middle where, as you make progress, the more you make progress, the more motivated you get. Anybody who's exercised knows this exactly. You've got to get started. Starting is the hardest. The first few minutes, the first few things you do are the hardest. But once you get a rhythm or you get going, then it gets easier. It's almost like friction. It's initially hard to push, but once you get moving, the friction eases up, right? And then an amazing thing happens at the end as well. Then you've got to shift. When you're near completion, people just get really motivated to just complete it, because completion itself gives you, such a rush, And I think just framing in your journey, having this start off and the middle and the finishing, and having the right frame, as I talk about in the book, backward comparison, the gradient, the motivation gradient, the more you do it, the better, the more motivated you get, because you feel that the friction is easing off. And then the completion effect, right? That the closer you are to completion, you really want to finish it off. That's why you kind of had a really, long swim, but the last lap, you can somehow find the energy to do really fast. If you're the last lap of running, you can just go fast. I don't know how you do it, but we do it. And that's all motivation. It's like convincing yourself, I'm going to finish it. So those 3 phases all together come in one package. And knowing how to deploy, or having a sensibility about your own learning trajectory, say, oh, I'm at this phase, let's do this. That kind of help. It's not foolproof, but at least scientifically, that's the kind of map that one would want to put in place.
Well, and it sounds like it could be important on a shorter term basis to have some type of plan that gives you that beginning, middle, and end. Because I think one of the bigger challenges people have, things like fitness goals are easy, or health goals are easy, because it's, here's where I am right now today, here's where I would like to be. But if it's something like business or finance or whatever it may be, you might not have an end in sight, right? Or that end might feel really far away. So it sounds like it could be helpful to break it up into much smaller pieces. This is my goal for the next 6 months, or this is my goal for the year. So I do have some type of finish line that I can look at.
Exactly. You change and that's a variation of the completion effect, basically what you've just described. That is, if you move the goalpost nearer, you get more motivated to complete it. So so tomorrow, if you want to read another 5 pages, you just tell yourself, well, instead of saying, instead of setting yourself a target, I'm going to read 50 pages tomorrow, instead, I'm just going to read 5. And you know what? When you start, 5 is going to feel a lot easier to complete than going for 50 straight up. You might not even jump into it.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and the one thing we describe it as lining up your dominoes, right? So many people, the explanation I always give, stand at the bottom of Everest and look at the very top and say, how am I going to get there? And it's just such a long distance to climb. It's about lining up your small dominoes to say, I don't need to get all the way to Everest. I just need to figure out how to get a half a mile in front of me, and then a half a mile after that, et cetera, until finally you look up one day and you're there.
Exactly. I sometimes struggle with when we go back to like swim. I love swimming, so sometimes you're really tired after work and you don't want to go to the pool. And I said, my goal today is to enter the pool and just do 1 lap. And that's it. But once I've done the 1 lap, I'm already here. I'm going.
Yeah, I've already in it. I've got my bathing suit. It's the hardest part.
It's like, it's the hack. It's really just convincing yourself that silly notion all I'm going to do today, if I get into the pool and all I do is one lap, I'll be happy. And guess what? You never come out after one lap alone. You always end up doing it. It's that kind of thinking. Hack it.
I'd love your perspective on the flip side of this coin, which is celebrating some success, however small that may be. Because in this focus around failure, my bet would be that we can often, and I'd love to hear if this has happened to you. My bet would be when you've got this focus or this freedom, really is what I would call it, around failure. You can strive and drive for failure potentially over success, or maybe not be as excited about success. Do you have any comments or thoughts on how to celebrate? Because I find that, especially for achievers, they get so focused on the next thing. They never really look backwards to say, wow, I'm proud of myself for just doing that one lap in the pool, or I'm proud of myself for showing up today, even though it was a hard one, or I'm proud of myself for doing this thing. It's almost always, I did this thing, on to the next.
Yeah, I think, that speaks to self-compassion and empathy, not just for yourself, but for others as well. It's not, I think it's just a good value and good practice to have. I can't speak for it from a scientific basis because scientific research is not up to speed, but yes, there's enough experiential basis that if we do that, I think we're just more, I think just developing compassion and empathy for yourself and for others is a really good thing. And part of that is to congratulate yourself and others, even in the small successes.
For sure. Well, maybe that could be the next book, Manu.
Yes.
That could be the next round of research. Before I let you go, I want to hear, especially because we have so many business owners and so many entrepreneurs who listen to this podcast, I'd love for your perspective on how to build a culture around this. I know some of these techniques are going to, by nature and by result, build a culture, but is there a way as a business owner, as a leader, to really actively and intentionally build a culture around productive failure?
Yeah, so I think there are 3 points, the three sort of ideas of what I call the first is failure as a mechanism. So in every time that you design new training or new learning, new challenges, I think use failure as a mechanism for trying these things, right? So whether you're iterating on a product, or you work for new training courses, or you're having a performance appraisal, I think that's having that conversation around what have you tried that has been really that you really struggled with. And also embodying that themselves. This is, being open about saying, "Oh, this has been a difficult few months, even for me as a leader or a manager." I think it's not easy to do that, but I think that's the kind of conversation that both leaders and teams and employees need to, you build a culture around that. And how that happens is you have to build that safe culture of psychological safety, right? So, different companies do it in different ways. Some have, failure stories as a mechanism. Others have team-based learning as a mechanism. Others have a performance appraisal completely around what did not work, like what I do with my PhD students. I'm not interested in what worked. I want to know what did not work. So that's where the interesting science could be. And I think the more we have these conversations, the more we model these things, we slowly build a culture. The more we reward, sorry, I forgot that. The more we reward, not the failure. The more we reward people trying to go beyond their boundaries and operating in that, zone of productive discomfort, as I call it. I think that needs to be rewarded as well. And I think the more you do these things, it takes time, but I've seen companies do that.
I love this focus around we're not rewarding failure itself, right? We don't want to celebrate failing at things, and yet we want to celebrate the courage or the behavior to fail so that we can learn from the result. Because you're right. I always think about sports teams, for example. They're not watching game tapes as closely if they won the game as they are if they lost the game. If they lost the game, they are picking apart every single play, who did what, where they can improve. Whereas if they won, intentionally or not, I have to imagine there's not as much focus around what they could do better next time because they won the game. They got the result that they were looking for. And so we're not celebrating the loss, certainly, but we are going to celebrate in what we learned in the process.
And our decision making always, especially both in sports and in business, there's a lot of decision making under uncertainty. Right? And so failure is naturally baked. You have an option to be safe, or you have an option to take a little bit of risk. And again, it goes back to that. Where is your balance as a company? And then early on in a startup, maybe you take a lot more risk and then you become safe overall. But as long as you're operating in some level of uncertainty, um, having a sense of the balance for that decision making, and always trying to have some level of risk involved, which will involve failure on the table, is always a good thing.
I love that. Manu, at the end of this podcast, we always ask, what's the one thing that you would want listeners to take away from this conversation today? Whether it's something we've already talked about or something that you want to make sure that you share, what's the one thing you would want them to walk away with?
And the one thing really is, don't wait for failure to happen. Take charge of your own learning, of your own growth, and find ways to design deliberately for failure in the initial learning when you're first coming to learn something new, and then try to harness that for deep learning later.
Thank you so much for being here today. I'm so excited for everyone to pick up the book. I'm excited for it to be coming out and to hear the incredible impact it's going to have on so many, because I know it will. And I think this is such an important conversation. So thank you for having it with us today.
Thank you, Nikki. I enjoyed it very much. Thank you.
And if people want to connect with you, Manu, where can they find you?
You can visit my website, manukapur.com, or through productivefailure.com. I'm also on LinkedIn, primarily, and on Twitter, and on Instagram, and of late as well. So yeah. Or just email. Google and email, that's fine too.
Amazing. Thank you, everyone, for listening. We'll see everybody next time.